My son and I attended a local Remembrance Day ceremony this morning, and it was nice for a number of reasons. It was nice to mark that occasion and just to take a moment to remember those who have gone before us and have given the ultimate sacrifice for our country and for the ideals that country represents. It was also nice because there was a number of members of my former fire department who were out in dress uniform as an honor guard and laying of a wreath. So it was nice to see them, and they look good in their uniforms, and certainly made the department and the community proud. And I am still proud to have been a member of that department. But with Remembrance Day, it also made me think about the legacy of residential schools here in Canada, as it's come up in the news recently, particularly about the flying the Canadian flag at half-staff that our Prime Minister ordered, I think, back in the spring. But I just want to talk about the residential school system a little bit more broadly. And I should say that I am by no means an expert in this. It's, I'm sure, a complex issue. It's historic. It involves politics, involves religion. So I'm sure it's complex and doesn't lend itself easily to simplifications. But I'll do my best to summarize my understanding of that program. So this was a policy undertaken by the Canadian government starting in the 19th century and going through most of the 20th century, as I understand it, which surprises a lot of people, myself included. And it was a policy by which the Canadian government would remove Indigenous children from their communities, from their families, and send them to essentially like a boarding school, called a residential school, where they would be taught English. They would be discouraged from practicing their own culture or language. So if they had long hair and braids, their hair would be cut. They would be dressed wearing more European, Western clothes, and encouraged to speak the language and assume the European culture that was representative of Canada at the time. And understandably and rightfully, now we look back and we see that that was certainly not a good policy, and it's certainly a blemish on Canadian history, and one that we have to reckon with. I'm wondering, again, I'm not an expert, but I can't help but wonder what it would have been like back in those days in terms of the dominant population. From what I understand, this was a policy that was discussed in Parliament, that it was done through official channels, that involved several churches. So it was done fairly out in the open. And the idea was the experts agreed that for their own good, that they were helping Indigenous communities by removing their children. And from what I understand, they didn't, although there might be exceptions, but generally they didn't actually remove them with force per se, but rather use coercion and pressure. They would tell the parents that most of whom were poor, uneducated, with low employment, and they would explain to the parents that it would be for their own good, for the children's own good, if they were to go to one of these schools, learn English, learn some working skills so that they could get gainful employment and participate in Canadian society. So it was by their authority that they thought they were helping these Indigenous communities. Looking back, we see the folly in that. We see the damage that's been done. The whole cultures have been lost or threatened to be lost directly because of this policy. But again, at the time, I imagine that the authorities of the day, the parliamentarians, the church workers, likely thought, most of them in their heart of hearts, that they were doing the right thing, that they were indeed helping these people, and that they were doing a noble thing to improve society. And I guess there's a number of lessons we can learn about that. I mean, at a fairly simplistic level, we could learn that maybe it makes sense to treat people of other cultures with dignity and kindness, and to treat them as we ourselves would like to be treated. I think that's certainly a good lesson. Another lesson is perhaps we shouldn't be so quick to assume that our own culture is right and good, and anything that's different than our own culture is necessarily bad and less good or not good. And that we should perhaps not be so quick to foist our culture on others. And more broadly, I think we should question, or one thing we can learn is maybe we shouldn't be so sure of ourselves that we actually know better for someone else. I think there's parallels here with these vaccine mandates. You have an authoritative class who is educated, who feels quite confident that they know what they're doing. They are willing to curtail the rights of people that perhaps they see as lesser, maybe less educated, less able to make their own decision, and that they're using coercion and other means to do something for what they see as their own good. And I wonder, with these vaccine mandates in 10 or 20 or 50 years, and we look back at the coercion, how are we going to, or how are future generations going to judge us for that? I saw recently that Sesame Street is using characters like Elmo and Big Bird to convince children to get vaccinated. Now again, I feel if you want to get your children vaccinated, you as an individual parent should be able to make that decision. You can weigh the costs and benefits. But I do find it really concerning to see that we would use Sesame Street characters to clearly try to get children to get their parents to have them get the vaccine. That really seems coercive to me, and I wonder if maybe we haven't fully learned the lessons that we ought to have learned as we look back at the Canadian residential school system.